During the First World War, the city of Halifax was the final safe harbor before undertaking the perilous voyage across the ocean to deliver troops and supplies to war-torn France and Belgium. Yet the cataclysm that occurred December 6, 1917, shattered that sense of refuge and many thousands of lives. It provided yet more proof how the insidious nature of war is destructive, even indirectly. It also proved that in disaster, as all other things fall away, people are naturally inclined to protect one another. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion. In Nova Scotia, there's a city named Halifax that rests on an inlet that opens up into the Atlantic Ocean. Ships and vessels seeking safe harbor from the tumultuous sea would find refuge here in Halifax, along with supplies, food and fuel, usually to help it complete its journey across the ocean. The inlet is composed of an outer harbor that flows into a channel barely half a kilometer wide at its narrowest. The channel was heavily trafficked, especially during the Great War. Maritime law dictated that incoming vessels keep to the east side of the channel, while vessels setting out towards the sea would keep to the western banks. Following this channel would lead the ships into an enclosed basin called the Bedford Basin. December 5, 1917, the SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo vessel, arrived at Bedford Harbour in Halifax carrying an extraordinary amount of highly reactive explosive cargo. The ship was meant to dock within the protective enclosure of the Bedford Basin, but it had arrived too late in the evening. Anti-submarine netting had been drawn across the channel to guard the port against German U-boats, which meant the Mont-Blanc had to maintain position until the netting would eventually be retracted the next morning. This probably would have been a stressful night as the ship was now not only behind schedule, it was also in a vulnerable position. At the same time, a Norwegian ship, the Imo, was leaving for New York to pick up wheat supplies for refugees in Belgium who had been displaced by the war. The crew of the Imo was under pressure to make haste, similar to the Mont-Blanc. There were several other ships in the harbor ahead of them waiting to be refueled, and the delay had cost them a full day. In the shipping industry, an empty and dormant transport vessel was enormously costly. This, no doubt, put the captain and crew in an agitated mindset. And as we all eventually learn, mistakes can be a byproduct of impatience. December 6, 1917. As soon as the sun rose, both ships prepared to move out. That morning, the Mont-Blanc was boarded by Harbour Master Francis Mackey to guide the ship through the proper docking procedures. Its holds were overladen with munitions and wartime supplies, including 2,366 tons of picric acid, also known as melinite by the French. It was used as a highly potent explosive meant for reducing fortifications to rubble. It was also highly corrosive to metal, and it fell from favor due to its challenging storage issues. 256 tons of TNT were also in storage. TNT was much more stable than picric acid, but could also be just as devastating and explosive. 246 tons of benzene fuel was stored on the top decks, and around 2,000 barrels. In addition to being used as a fuel, it was used in the rubber industry as a solvent, an explosive agent, and even had applications in chemical warfare. And finally, 62 tons of gun cotton, or nitrocellulose. It was more than 4 times as explosive as gunpowder and a much more potent propellant for high-velocity projectiles, torpedo warheads, and certain grenades. However, it was yet another highly unstable substance that was stacked on top of thousands of tons of unstable substances, all floating on what some may call the largest non-stable substance in the world, the ocean. As morning wore on, there were a dozen ships starting or ending their own particular voyage. And as the Mont-Blanc was entering the channel and heading towards the Bedford Basin, the Norwegian vessel, the Imo, was entering the channel from the opposing direction. An American steamer named the Clara forced the Imo into the eastern side of the channel. At this time in history, it wasn't the most uncommon occurrence for ships to exercise some flexibility in the rules during busy times, but even so, it wasn't considered safe protocol to travel in opposing lanes of traffic. As the Imo steered carefully to the east, another ship named the Stella Maris was also traveling in the wrong direction, pushing the Imo further to the east. This set the stage for conflict as the Imo approached the Mont-Blanc and its cargo hold of thousands of tons of munitions held above and below deck, faithfully at the narrowest checkpoint. The Mont-Blanc blasted its horns to signal to the Imo to navigate into the appropriate lane on the western side. In response, the Imo sounded its whistle to communicate that they were holding course and did not intend to move. In retrospect, it all seems very reckless, but these moments pass relatively quickly, and large ocean-going vessels are certainly not very agile navigators in tight spaces. The Mont-Blanc swung hard to port, while at the same time the Imo reversed engine thrust. The Imo slowed but was captured by the current of the channel, directing the sharp bow of the ship to turn into the veering Mont-Blanc. The metal bow of the Imo punctured the hull of the Mont-Blanc, and as the metal screeched against metal, glowing sparks showered the 2,000 barrels of benzene that were held on the top decks of the munitions vessel. The benzene ignited, and great black billowing clouds soon engulfed the Mont-Blanc, shrouding the vision of the crew, choking the air with volatile fumes. The Mont-Blanc lost control, and the current slowly brought it drifting closer and closer to the city of Halifax. Crew and captain abandoned their charge and launched life vessels. Some jumped into the channel with the terrible understanding that nowhere was safe from what was on board. Vince Coleman was a heroic telegraph operator who played a pivotal role during the events that took place on December 6th. Realizing the imminent danger, Coleman stayed at his post to send urgent telegraph messages to stop incoming trains, notably the inbound passenger train number 10, warning them to halt and avoid the catastrophe. His selfless act saved countless lives as his final message read, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." Shortly after, Vince Coleman perished in the blast, but his bravery and dedication to duty left an enduring legacy of heroism, including a maritime museum exhibition of several belongings on his person at the time of his passing. A telegraph key, pen, wallet, and his timepiece. The Niobe, a cruiser that was docked in the channel close by, immediately sent a small rescue boat. If this hadn't been a wartime setting, the Mont-Blanc would be displaying full warning flags all across the exterior of their vessel, highly recognizable symbols of danger. The flags were removed to help avoid it from being specifically targeted by enemy vessels. The fog of war manifested in many forms, and in this instance, misunderstanding was quite deadly. The Niobe had no idea what loomed just in front of them. Regardless, as the rescue vessels approached, bystanders and onlookers began gathering on the shores to watch the disaster unfold. Mont-Blanc crew members frantically waved the rescuers and onlookers away, shouting and screaming. Either the crowds couldn't understand the French language or didn't see their frantic waving. The Stella Maris, upon viewing the billowing dark clouds and receiving distress signals, turned back from the Bedford Basin and re-entered the channel, making for the burning Mont-Blanc to lend assistance. The rescue vessels came upon the distressed ship in the blink of an eye, 3 kilotons of volatile chemicals ignited, reaching 5,000 degrees Celsius, nearly the temperature of the surface of the sun. The cataclysm swallowed up the port up to several streets away. It vaporized the hull of the Mont-Blanc along with hundreds of onlookers, crew, and rescuers all in an instant. Just as devastating, the concussive force of the blast swept through the area at 1,000 meters per second. The shockwave collapsed buildings, twisted infrastructure, and threw people through the air. Most of the windows in the city were shattered inward, causing innumerable eye injuries, lacerations, or worse. Within a certain vicinity of the epicenter of the blast, anything combustible ignited, causing a firestorm throughout the city. Even the channel itself was weaponized as water that was displaced by the massive explosion rushed outward, causing a tsunami that reportedly rose several stories high, launching ships, including the Imo, out of the channel, killing everyone on board. The 1.4-ton anchor of the Mont-Blanc was launched over the entirety of the city of Halifax and landed 2.25 miles away. In years to come, the anchor shaft itself was incorporated into a stone monument and today still stands just where it landed in recognition of the magnitude of the calamity. 2,000 people were gone in the blink of an eye. 9,000 people suffered a variety of injuries. 12,000 homes were destroyed and every structure within a 12-mile radius was damaged. In the ensuing chaos, soldiers rushed to station, many believing the war had reached Halifax and the port was under attack. Sadly, many people could have survived if rescue efforts were immediately launched, but in the fog of war, people simply couldn't have understood the true source of the explosion. Several hours had passed before word had truly spread of what actually happened. Firefighters, police, and military mustered and focused their efforts on sorting through rubble, searching for survivors while military ships were diverted to Halifax to offer assistance. Medical facilities were severely compromised, so the ships were turned into makeshift hospitals. Citizens were organized and rallied by Army command, while children were conscripted as message carriers and were seen running through the ruins of the city to deliver information. Services were immediately overwhelmed, and to make matters worse, the weather grew colder and colder. The freezing temperatures gave way to a calamitous blizzard that covered the ruined city in a deep, heavy snow. The people who had been left homeless, trapped beneath the rubble, or injured were now forced to contend with a coastal snowstorm. By the next day, several feet of snow covered all, making relief efforts nearly impossible. Trains were forced to halt in place, stalling relief efforts mere miles away from those who desperately needed them. Newspaper articles at the time reported there were nearly 20,000 survivors trapped in Halifax. The city of Boston was one of the first major responders. They were able to muster aid so quickly that a fair bit of it arrived just before the storm. This effort forged a relationship between Nova Scotia and Boston that can be seen today. The Boston Commons Christmas tree is an emblem of remembrance to honor their bond, and it's donated each year ever since the accident. Trains also arrived that day and in the following days from other cities, some as far as Amherst, Nova Scotia, and Moncton, New Brunswick. 52 miles away, the USS Tacoma, a military guard vessel, experienced the shockwaves of the Halifax blast, and it sent the ship's company to safe quarters, as they feared there was an attack underway. On the horizon, a mushroom cloud rose into the sky, and the USS Tacoma and the USS Von Steuben made for Halifax, and by midday, both ships went to work uncovering survivors and clearing paths through the streets. In the coming days, many efforts, both civic and legislative, were levied to alleviate the suffering of those who lost so much. Matthew Callum Grant, the governor, established the Halifax Relief Commission to cover medical treatments, housing costs, as well as funeral expenditures. Interestingly, the commission was dissolved in 1976, as the final pensions were paid out to relatives of workers and survivors. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind was also established at this time due to an overwhelming occurrence of eye injuries. The shockwaves of the explosion shattered nearly every window in the city, and those standing close by did not have the time to protect themselves. Predictably, inquiries were formed to investigate the reasons for the blast, whether negligence was the cause, or if something more malevolent was at play. After all, much of the West was at war, and rumors arose of foreign spies and saboteurs. The Judicial Committee soon arrived at the conclusion that the responsibility lied primarily with Harbour Master Francis Mackey, who boarded the Mont-Blanc the morning of the explosion, and Mont-Blanc's captain, Le Medec. As the Mont-Blanc was the party that had possession of the full picture of their dangerous cargo, they were in a position to carry the burden of responsibility. Considering the captain and the crew fled from their charge left many feeling as though they had abandoned this responsibility. However, as a fuller picture began to form, it became clear that the Imo, who had been traveling at a high rate of speed on the wrong side of the channel, had contributed to a very dangerous situation. Yet, in a series of escalating events, Imo itself had been forced into this position as well. In the end, there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges against Francis Mackey and Captain Le Medec. It's easy to recognize that people were shocked and they were outraged, and there was a desire for some bit of recompense. The only commanding officials who participated in this event and lived to tell the tale were these two men. As with all disasters of magnitude, lines can be drawn to ever-reducing points of failure, thus proving that however small an action may seem in the present, there's always the possibility for it to snowball into a major event. And perhaps our intention may be to maintain absolute vigilance at all times, but as human beings, that's not really realistic. Eventually, our will wane, our attention will falter, and accidents are going to happen. And on that encouraging note, thank you for listening. If you found my work here to be interesting, I hope that you'll like or subscribe. If you have any advice or guidance for me, don't hesitate to share that with me. Thank you for listening, and stay safe, everyone.